The 121st Special Forces Group is a U.S. ARMA unit set in the modern military era. To learn more about our unit, join the 121st Discord. 2 years ago, our unit began fighting Russians in Eastern Europe. Yes, before Russia even invaded Ukraine in real life. We were then shipped off to a fictional country set in the South China Sea, where we faced off against a joint invasion by the PLA and Russia. Since then, the world has seen several regional wars pop up all around the globe, where the US, Russia, and China are backing opposite sides of the conflict. This period has been dubbed the Global Proxy War. Unofficially recognized by the US military, the 121st has been sent to aid in these proxy wars. Starting in a fictional country located off the coast of Northern Europe, this country was strategic to the oil reserves located in the Arctic. After Russia assisted in a military coup in the country, the 121st was sent to prevent the legitimate government from being overthrown. After the conclusion of this campaign, the 121st was retasked to a fictional region in North Africa called KR. North and South KR had a long history of violence resulting in their separation. South KR slowly became a strategic ally of the US, and when the president of North KR was assassinated, all hell broke loose in the region. After a long and hard-fought campaign, the 121st was able to help our allies bring order to the chaos. Today, I will be telling you about the background of our next campaign. This is the story of Narales. Narales consists of several islands off the coast of South America. The country is named after its largest main island, while another prominent island is called Alero. Its closest neighbor is Montadalia, a country in the northwest region of South America, stretching from the oceans to the Andes. Although our campaign will begin in Narales, as you will learn in this story, Montadalia is integral to the situation in Narales. For many years, Narales struggled with rampant crime caused by several cartels constantly fighting for control over the country. With massive pressure from the citizen population and support from the United States war on drugs in South America, by 2010, the Naralian government was able to dismantle most of the cartels. After organized crime subsided, Narales began heavily investing in their economy, with the goal of expanding into various refinery industries. This was greatly aided by the strong trading relationship with their nearest neighbor, Montadalia. Off the shore of Montadalia are massive oil reserves, second only to Venezuela in the region. As oil prices soared at the start of the 21st century, the country became extremely wealthy, but the citizens started seeing the formation of a massive wealth gap. Not long after, the country's leadership began creating massive social welfare programs to help lift many citizens out of poverty. It was not long before things took a turn for the worse. From June 14th to February 15th, oil prices fell by almost 70%. Burdened by the cost of the social programs, the government almost went into bankruptcy. Montadalia saw a massive spike in organized crime. One organization in particular rose to prominence during this time. The San Alejandría de Maturin cartel, also known as the Saints, went from being a relatively small cartel to one of the fastest growing in the world. Little is known of their origin, but their success stemmed from their leaders' ability to cooperate and often negotiate with rivals and government officials to expand their business. However, they were never shy about demonstrating their ruthlessness to anyone who challenged them. With oil prices never recovering from their peak for sustained periods of time, Montadalia continued to experience economic turmoil. Being so dependent on trade with Montadalia, the Naralian economy also suffered alongside them. In a desperate attempt to correct this issue, Narales looked to expand their trade relationships. Although by the end of the 2020s, they had built stronger ties with Chile and Colombia, and even substantially grew their trade relationship with the US, they were still heavily dependent on Montadalia to keep their economy afloat. Montadalia's economy was hitting an all-time low when the president was re-elected. He declared a national state of emergency, which had massive impacts on the government and the stability of their democracy. The president began using multinational corporations as a scapegoat for the country's issues and started restricting foreign investment. This led to the collapse of their dollar and central economy and made the situation ripe for organized crime. The Saints were becoming one of the largest cartels in the world, rivaling the Sinaloa cartel. Montadalians had become almost completely dependent on the black market for essential goods, and through bribery and coercion of several government officials, the Saints cartel quickly cornered the black market. They were rapidly expanding into money laundering and weapons trafficking, and even started some small-scale weapons manufacturing. However, their primary business was still the production and distribution of natural and synthetic street drugs. Their growth was only hindered by the reliance on Chinese criminal organizations for precursor chemicals. The president's goal of pushing out foreign corporations and investors backfired, and with many struggling corporations left in the wake of this decision, the Saints were able to invest into several legitimate businesses. Not only did this allow them to legitimately increase the importation of essential materials for their drug operations, it also allowed them to massively expand money laundering operations. They were even able to buy large stakes in several oil and gas companies. By the end of the 2030s, the Saints' combined legal and illegal operations made them the largest organization in Montadalia and were expanding globally. At the same time, a new leader in the government emerged, Andre Fernandez Delgado, and ran under the banner of returning to democracy, restoring freedom, and bringing about peace and stability in the country. He won a landslide victory, but upon taking power, did very little to change the government structure. Unlike his predecessor, who stood at odds with the Saints cartel, many began suspecting Delgado had ties to the organization. Fortunately for him, tensions began ramping up between the US, Russia, and China, and the demand for oil drastically increased. The Montadalian economy began seeing a recovery, but the large stake the Saints cartel had in the oil industry meant their empire was also growing even larger. While the cartel continued to grow, we also saw the emergence of a new leader, Isabel Gonzalez. Her willingness to reinvest much of the cartel's profit into community projects quickly made her a favorite among many of the citizens. She would often proclaim it was her religious duty to support the people, and when you cannot count on the government, you can always count on God and the Saints. With the next World War on the horizon, many South American countries began worrying about what would happen to them. Most of these countries had large trading relationships with both sides of the conflict, and were worried sanctions imposed by either side might jeopardize their relationships. In response, Brazil proposes the South American Treaty Association, also known as SEDA. Essentially, South American countries signing on to CETA would remain neutral in any future conflict, maintain free trade among each other, and refuse to trade with any nation who attempts to enforce sanctions or violate another member's sovereignty. In response, China and Russia formed the Sino-Russia Alliance Program, or SRA. Any nation signing onto the SRA would have access to the financial support in the form of foreign aid and investment, in addition to a free trade agreement. In exchange, these nations were expected to act in the best interests of their allies. The US also offered a similar agreement called the American Democratic Alliance. Ultimately, most of the South American nations signed on to CETA, including Argentina, Peru, and Ecuador, creating a massive trading bloc in South America and effectively forcing the superpowers to allow them to maintain their neutrality. Although all South American countries were technically invited, Brazil and the other major countries were reluctant to sign any country with extremely close ties to a superpower. This meant Bolivia, Suriname, Venezuela, and Montadalia signed with the SRA, while Colombia, Chile, and Narales signed with the ADA. Just before war broke out in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, the superpowers began enforcing sanctions, and Montadalia was pressured to cut off their trade relationships with Narales. This only had a minor impact on their economy, as their oil exports were keeping the country afloat. Narales, on the other hand, was still dependent on Montadalia, and the newly imposed sanctions hurt their economy. Once war broke out, support from the US began to slow down as they were focusing their resources on fighting wars in several countries. This meant Narales' economy was entering a state of almost complete collapse, and the country began seeing a re-emergence of criminal organizations. The Saints had been operating on a very small capacity in Narales, but quickly took advantage of the situation. Between their stranglehold over the Montadalian government and their smuggling expertise, they were able to get around the sanctions and began transporting goods back and forth between the two countries. With almost no alternatives, many Naralian corporations had to either work with the cartel or face financial ruin. To make matters worse, the Saints were able to take advantage of the close relationship between Narales and the US and their allies to maintain their drug distribution network in the West. This became even more important as the Saints also began distributing a new drug called PDO 37, known on the street as Super Coke or Super C for short. According to what people are saying, Super C is similar to other neurotropics, and regardless of the truth behind this, it is extremely important and highly addictive. The drug is quickly becoming the drug of choice for many in the middle and upper classes in America and other Western countries. More importantly, the skyrocketing demand for Super C made the Saints the largest criminal organization, and their smuggling operations through Narales was critical to that success. Although the unstable economy in Narales did not help, many criticized them for ignoring the rise of the Saints in their country, whether it was out of pride for dismantling their cartels in the past, or out of fear of not knowing how to stop them. People were comparing their response to a deer in headlights. The strong law enforcement organizations they built up over the last couple of decades began to crumble. Budgets began to shrink, and the anti-corruption laws put in place were eroding. With nowhere to turn, many Naralans began to work for the cartel, and it wasn't long until the Saints had control over several regions. Many attribute this expansion to Isabella Gonzalez's motto she adopted from Pablo Escobar, Plato o Pomo, meaning silver or lead. In desperation, President Esteban Galvez and the Naralian government declared war on the Saints and any other criminal organizations. Unfortunately, this had little impact. The police were already ineffective at dealing with the issue, and the budget cuts meant the military was ill-prepared and unable to help in any major capacity. Over the next 12 months, the Saints brought to bear significant resources to fight the government. The situation became so ugly, at some points the Saints were able to briefly take control of military bases, take many of their assets, all with little or no resistance. When questioned about how these cartels took bases so easily, many high-ranking personnel would blame the government for the lack of resources and assistance, claiming their troops were unwilling to put up a fight, knowing many of them would be killed. At Isabel Gonzalez's orders, any government employee or official willing to surrender or cooperate would be unharmed and often rewarded for their cooperation. Unlike many other criminal organizations, people were claiming her soldiers were often fanatical in their compliance towards her and her lieutenants. Given this behavior, more and more were less inclined to fight, and the government suspects they were willing to take bribes instead. The government also suspects many former soldiers began signing up to work for the cartel. What was clear to the government was the Saints were an extremely challenging adversary, and what was worse was their ability to stay ahead of the government. Distrust among the government and their inability to control the situation, coupled with the Saints' focus on giving back to the communities, led to significant civil unrest, and many began blaming the government for the subsequent violence. It was clear Narales was heading down the same road Montadalia went down decades prior. With no significant foreign aid or assistance, Narales was powerless to prevent this. Historically, Narales was a strong democratic country built upon the principles of free market capitalism. The government consists of several different parties, often representing different regions or political interests. Unfortunately, the situation in Narales was starting to change all of this. A new political party, best translated as the Revolutionary Affiliation for Democracy, quickly emerged leading up to the previous election. Led by Carlos Carvalho, he is relatively unknown except for being discharged from the military service by his brother Colonel Fabian Carvalho for consistently failing to fulfill his basic duties as an officer. Fabian leads the Army's anti-cartel division, also known as the BAN unit, or just BAN. According to Fabian, Carlos became indoctrinated in left-wing socialist propaganda and began rejecting the relationship their country and military had with the West. Carlos would often claim the country's democracy was heavily influenced by propaganda from Colombia, Chile, and the US, and could no longer be trusted. Many of Carlos' detractors felt his attitude and platform were a carbon copy to Montadalia's President Delgado, and if he rose to power, he would dismantle the country's democracy. Carlos claims his platform is centered around moving Narales away from their allies in the West and towards becoming a truly independent state, where traditional capitalism would be replaced by a system that would provide equal opportunities and benefits to all Naralians. Many Naralians feeling left out of SETA due to their historical ties to the West, this message was becoming appealing, and in the last election, his party was able to gain a substantial number of seats. Soon after, he began working with other small left-wing parties to form an opposition party that had more seats than President Galvez's Heritage Alliance Party. Like most Naralian politicians, Carvalho was also accused of corruption, and some even suspects he was in the Saints' pocketbooks and they were the ones financing his campaign. Although there was no proof of this, the mere notion a radical leader like Carvalho could rise to power was troubling to Colombia and Chile. Not only was Narales their only other ally in the region, but their unique location between the two nations made trade access extremely easy. More importantly, Narales was becoming an important trade partner to Colombia, and despite the flow of illegal drugs, Colombia was hoping to work with the existing government to clamp down on the Saints' operations. The US had also begun minor operations within Narales once Super C began spreading in America. Becoming increasingly concerned about the situation, the Colombian government began requesting the US to increase their support. No longer burdened by direct conflict with Russia and China, and only participating in several proxy wars, the US began providing Narales with foreign aid to bolster their police and military, in addition to increasing their investment into several industries. To no one's surprise, the Saints did not take kindly to any foreign presence trying to interfere with their operations, and began violently targeting any individuals, governments, or civilians who were working with the US or any other foreign ally of the West. Carvalho was quick to take advantage of the ensuing violence, suggesting President Galvez brought this upon himself and should be held accountable for the violence. Carvalho argued that instead of looking for a peaceful resolution, he was crawling back to the US and their allies to solve the country's problems. As more and more citizens began resonating with this message, it was clear the country was becoming more divided by the day. With the presidential elections only 1 year away, many were questioning if the government would even survive that long, and many who still support the government felt that if they could not find a way to effectively combat the Saints' operations in the country, the government and country would completely destabilize. Recognizing what was happening, Colombia once again asked for further assistance from the US. Publicly, the US government did not want to interfere militarily in any official capacity. Although technically Narales, Montadalia, Colombia, and Chile were not part of SEDA, Ecuador and Peru were still nearby, and further increasing tensions in the region may result in a backlash from the alliance. The 121st has a proven track record of successful covert operations in several countries, and the DoD called upon them again. In May 2042, the 121st will be covertly entering Narales with the aim of helping stabilize the country by assisting the local government combat the Saints and any other criminal organizations. Although not formally recognized in the region, the 121st will be reporting directly to U.S. Ambassador Thomas Morris.